So I actually changed the name of the topic of the talk to Speed Up Your Team. I thought it was more direct. It had more force and power to it, so I liked it. Yeah, I got kind of obsessed with this. As Jonathan said, I have a background in organizational design. I actually started off my life as a newspaper designer. So I've worked in some very, very, very dysfunctional environments over the years. And then I was a UX designer, but we called ourselves information architects or interaction designers back in those days. Transitioned into product management, transitioned from that into agile coaching, where I worked with some very, very large and very dysfunctional IT organizations at places like Travelers and Ford and GE. And then I transitioned into management consulting, where I worked with executives on many of the same issues we were working at the team level or at the execution level in the IT. So I've kind of bounced around an awful lot, but my obsession has always been, how do we make organizations function better? How do we create organizations? Because I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but organizations are kind of broken, right? Like how many people think they work in a dysfunctional organization? Mildly, yeah. No one at Citrusbyte, raise your hand. Right, okay, good. What I found is that, especially as a product manager, is that everybody thought I was moving too slowly. They thought my team was moving too slowly. They thought I wasn't doing enough. And so I responded in some very, I think, human ways. And these were my strategies. Let's see if you think they would work. My strategy was lower quality, right? How can we cut some corners here in order to make stuff go faster? How can I work longer hours, kind of trying to increase the size of the pipe, my own capacity? And of course, the wonderful frantic effort, right? Running in the office. I always think of running in the office as a sign that you're probably in a dysfunctional organization. If someone feels the need to run, what we do is important, but it's not that important, people, right? What do you guys think this would add up to? If not speed, what does it add up to? Poor quality, burnout, failure, in some case, divorce, right? Right, it's just not, it's not good. It's not good stuff. I had an ulcer for a little while, which I thankfully really don't have anymore. So I started becoming a student of speed, and I became a student of lean theory and a student of agile. And one of the things I noticed is, if I look around the offices, the people that are the most productive, or at least the people that have the most influence in the organization, tend to be kind of calm. They're not the ones running in the office. The most functional teams that I worked on, the ones that were producing the best output, were kind of calm. And what I realized was that I think there's a correlation here. I think there's a causation here between calmness and between speed. And what I found is that indeed we can speed up things, but we have to be really aware. We have to be smart about what we do, and we also have to be somewhat disciplined. The bad news is that we're dealing with humans, that we're dealing with human systems, and these three things don't come very naturally to human systems, but I think we can engineer them in. And I want to walk you through some kind of first principles. These comes out of lean and agile theory. They won't be probably completely new to all of you, but hopefully the way I put them together will lead to some interesting insights. So let's go along for the ride. So the first thing we have to understand when we think about speed is that speed is an actual thing, and it's a thing that is subdividable. It is a thing that is divisible into actually two separate elements. And if you try to act on speed naturally, you end up, kind of instinctively, you'll end up acting on one element in a positive way and either not influencing the other element or even negatively impacting the other element, and you end up kind of right back where you started. So you've put in a lot of effort, but you've come out with really nothing to show for it. Those two elements are throughput and cycle time. Are these words new to anybody in the room? Okay, thank God. All right, wonderful. So throughput, of course, is the size of your pipe. It's the amount of capacity that you have in your system. And cycle time is the amount of time it takes one item to move from the beginning to the end of that system. Helps to have some metaphors always. Throughput, I think of as, I'd love to visualize a highway for this. It's the number of cars that this highway can process. In order to measure it, we have to get really specific. We have to say it's this highway, it's this specific piece of highway. And it's also, we'll have to add a time element. So cars per hour through on this 1 mile section of the BQE, right? Something like that. We have to be very specific if we're going to measure throughput. And of course, it's very hard to influence something and impact something if we don't have some kind of measurement against it. We'll talk about that before we're done today. Cycle time, on the other hand, is how long does it take this guy at the end of the line to get his cup of coffee? More accurately, it's what's the average amount of processing time for an individual to get their coffee at the coffee shop. And of course, that's going to vary based on, what is that based on? What's that? Where you are in the line. And where you are on the line, or the length of the line, also varies based on what time of day you arrive there. So in order to measure this and impact this, you might want to say, what's our average cycle time during the morning rush hour, which is generally between these kinds of hours, right? All right, so throughput and cycle time. We're going to have to be really deliberate about impacting these two things if we're going to speed up our teams as much as we can. So there's some things we can do to influence speed. But before we get there, I want to talk about the things we can't do to influence speed. So remember that thing that I talked about before, lowering quality, working longer hours, and increasing the pace of work. These are really, really, really shitty ways to try to improve speed, right? They don't do much to our speed, and when they do, they end up creating a lot of negative, unintended consequences, right? If we lower quality to the point where we can't integrate software or integrate code as we're releasing it, we end up, everything crashes, everything falls apart. If we work really long hours, what happens if we work too many hours? Divorce again, right? Yeah, right. So, and if we work at a really frantic pace, what happens? Yeah, mistakes. I think also attrition right now. Everybody's hiring. Like we heard a lot of people hiring. I think culture is really important. I think the kinds of organizations we want to create are really important. So the first thing we're going to do if we're going to talk about speeding things up is we're going to talk about what we're not going to do. And we're going to have a really, really real conversation with each other about what the level of quality is appropriate for this thing that we're building. If we're working on a game, our level of quality we may be more sort of risk tolerant or fault tolerant than if we're working on, say, a medical application or a financial application of some kind, right? So we're going to have a conversation about what is quality, what are our tolerances, how are we going to measure it, and we're going to set it, right? We're going to set that. At the same time, we're going to set our hours, and that's a very cultural issue, right? We tend to go home at a certain time. It's not to say that we don't rush that we don't expand this from time to time, but this is not the way we try to speed things up. This is not the way we try to create a sustainable speed in our system. And likewise, pace is a little more ephemeral. It's like a little harder to quantify. But at the same time, we're going to really think about the kind of pace, the kind of place that we want to work. And I think these are really foundational. This is a values conversation. This is a culture conversation. And in many ways, this is also a process conversation. But this is where we start. So can everybody agree with me that these are things that we probably shouldn't change all that much? Yeah. Yeah, for the most part, right? I forgot I had this in here. We end up like this otherwise. I should have queued that up a lot better. But yeah, not a lot of quality, not a lot of quality of life, right? Yeah. Not a lot of throughput there. So then we start to want to maximize throughput. Does this look like a good maximal throughput system? That look good? Looks like a good flow? How about that? Would you want to drive at 80 miles an hour in that? Right. So probably we're not talking a maximal throughput. Everybody naturally tries to maximize throughput by doing this. This is what we try to do. We say the sooner we start something, the sooner we finish, which, by the way, is a sign of a dysfunctional team. And we try to jam as much stuff into the system as we possibly can, figuring that, well, something's going to come out. I know the executives that I've worked with at big organizations, they often say, I ask for 50% to 75% more than what I know I can get out of my team because that's the way you motivate a team. By the way, that's not the way you motivate a team. It does not result in a motivated team. It turns out that in order to maximize throughput, we actually have to have some space in our system. Some space in our system actually, so we need to focus on the space, not on the car. So that's the first thing I want you to do is focus on the space, not on the thing that's moving through the system. We call this Slack, by the way, which was stolen by that wonderful startup that we all depend on. But we introduce Slack into the system. So we actually consciously think about, it's like when you're a designer, many of your designers here, thinking about negative space. I want you to think about the negative space in your workflow and consciously introduce some of that. And we'll talk about how to do that in just a moment. So your rule number one, introduce Slack to maximize throughput. We don't want to stand in this line. Why? Why don't we want to stand in this line? Because it sucks, yeah. There's no, well, we moved on to the next thing, which is cycle time. The cycle time is going to be very low in this line. So whatever's through this door must be really amazing coffee or something really wonderful. I don't know what it is, in order to get people to stand in this kind of line. I think it must be like in LA, these are all actors, some kind of curtain call or something, or what do they call that? Cattle call, right? So looking at a line, if I want to reduce the cycle time of people in this line, and if I've standardized the quality that this guy is operating at, if I've standardized the number of hours this person's working, and I've standardized, and he's working at a reasonable pace, I really don't have much left in order to speed up cycle time on this. But I do have one thing, and that's I shorten the line. All right? So this is our concept. Introduce Slack to maximize throughput, shorten our queues. We're going to go all Anglo on this, right? Because that's where lean theory comes from. Shorten our queues to minimize our cycle time. All right? These are our two rules. Again, we're going to discuss about how to make this happen in just a minute. So in a software environment, the way this works is the first thing we have to think about is if we want to introduce Slack into our system, we introduce something called a WIP limit, or a work in process limit, right? You guys have heard about this before? Yeah. Anybody actively working with a WIP limit? Yes, Citrusbyters, raise their hands. Wonderful. So essentially what you do is you say we're going to have only 4 things operating on this highway right now, 4 cars operating on this highway right now. We're going to put a sensor at the end. And when one thing leaves, it basically creates a space so we can pull something else into the system. We call this a pull-based system. This is basic lean theory. So this works for cars. It also happens to work for requirements. So imagine these blocks. These are chunks of described value, described business value. We have a team who is turning them into released code in the customer's hands. And we can back the requirements process up as far as we want to. It could be when the requirement gets written. It could be when we sense the need from the customer. It could go, we can go back and back. But essentially, when you're building software, we're turning thoughts and ideas and customer needs into working code that's actually in the customer's hands. So that's the pipeline that we're generating. And the idea is that we would have a WIP limit. I'm suggesting 4 for this particular system. Your mileage may vary, but we generate a WIP limit. So let's just, The problem is, when we generate the WIP limit, we also generate, what's that over there? A backlog. We generate a queue. And what do we have to do in order to minimize cycle time? We have to shorten our queues, right? So we're going to limit WIP to introduce Slack, but now we have to somehow shorten our queue. We don't really have much we can do, because what have we standardized? Quality, number of hours, the pace we're working at, the normal things that we might try to operate on. So we only have a couple of things left to do. We actually only have one thing left to do, and that's we have to what's called delay commitment. Again, this is a tried and true sort of lean idea. We delay commitment until what they call the last responsible moment. It turns out there's some great benefit when you delay commitment. For one thing is if I don't commit to something, by the time I do commit to it, I actually have more information. I have kind of the best information at that time. But really, in order to keep this queue short over here, I really have to put this kind of impermeable layer in between the things that I might do and the things that I have committed that I'm sure that I will do. This obviously presents a serious problem when you're dealing with a CEO or a customer or somebody screaming at you. You can say, and what does a product manager like to say at that moment? No? That's what you want to say, but what do you actually say?
We'll fit it in somehow.
We'll fit it in somehow. It's on the backlog is what I was looking for, actually. It's on the backlog, right? This can still be your backlog as far as your customer is concerned. We're not really sure we're going to get that. You can do some road mapping potentially around this kind of stuff, and there are some methodologies for that. But really, we want to be delaying commitment until the last responsible moment, and we're creating a kind of impermeable layer in between what we might do and what we will do. So we limit WIP in order to introduce Slack. We delay commitment in order to keep our queues short. All right? These are the two rules. So processes and tools and things we can do to actually impact things. So first thing everybody always asks is, why can't we just add more people? This is the first thing that my bosses were asking anyway. Why don't we just add more people? Why don't we just hire more people? One, people are very hard to find, especially right now. Two, you're going to add expense. Oh, by the way, what I'm signifying here is the easiest way to take this big line and shorten it is to break it into 2, right? But in order to do that, you basically have to double the capacity. You either hire another barista, you open another shop down the street, whatever that may be. But the easiest way to shorten a line is to split it in 2. But we've added expense. And more importantly, I think, in the software environment is we've added complexity. We've added the need for more conversations. We've added the need to bring more people on board. And that's why there's a guy named Fred Brooks. Has anybody ever heard of Fred Brooks? Yeah, there you go. Brooks' law, I gender neutralize this, adding human power to a late software project makes it later. Has anybody ever experienced this as 100% true? Yeah. This is really true. It's amazing how true this is and how universal this experience is, and yet how often this is the natural place we go. Let's just hire some more people, which is okay if you're going to hire Citrusbyte, but it's not okay, generally speaking, right? The other thing that we need to do before we get directly into the process and tools is one more lean concept, and that is that we want to make decisions close to the point of activity, or as close to the point of activity as is humanly possible. If we're talking about building software, who are the people close to the point of that activity? Engineers. What's that? Product managers, designers, right? People doing it, maybe not, but yeah, users as well. Quarterbacks, yeah. It's the team, right? So just like we don't want a play called from the owner level, right? We also don't necessarily want the impact or the process or the tool to be applied at the ownership level inside of our organizations. I learned this the hard way because I went to work for companies like GE, and like I had the managers behind me. I was like, yes, we're going to go and implement an amazing process. And I found it was harder to implement the process from that level than it was when I got access to the team level, that it was actually much, much easier to introduce a functional process from the team level. You have to work at the team level. So we need empowered teams who focus on a few items at a time and selectively commit to new work. This is what maximizes throughput and minimizes cycle time. And this is basically the only thing that does it. It's kind of a harsh reality, and it's kind of hard to get here. But I have a few sort of tips and tricks and ways to potentially get there. I could talk about this all day. In fact, I am paid to talk about this all day sometimes. And feel free to ask me questions afterwards about the specifics. But I tried to kind of capture what I think of as the first principles, the things that we really need to do if we're going to create this kind of system. And the last one's kind of interesting, but I'll see if you like it. The first thing is we need small teams with clear accountabilities making collaborative decisions. When I say a small team, I'm going to go all Scrum on you, and I'm going to say 7 plus or minus 2, 5 to 9 people. We actually even do less people. Some of our teams at Citrusbyte are even smaller, which is fine. And sometimes our teams at Citrusbyte are actually bigger, which is also fine if your teams are experienced, have worked together a long time, all know the process, are mature and self-responsible and all of these things. 7 plus or minus 2 is a really good rule of thumb for everybody. And I think when you're first starting out, it can be really helpful. Just like if you're a jazz musician just starting out, it's very helpful to play your scales, right? It's very helpful to have a really, really strict process in the beginning, something like Scrum or XP. But once you develop the habits and the sort of maybe the intuitive sense of how these things work, you can break away from firm process. And I'm speaking as someone who has been a process coach for many years and who has implemented a lot of these very strict processes in organizations. I think you don't get mature by being inside of a strict process. You get mature by maybe trying one and building your own. But really, it's sort of an internal capability. But small teams keeps complexity to a minimum. Clear accountabilities means that that team knows what it's responsible for, and more importantly, it knows what it's not responsible for and what it's not able to influence and what it's not able to comment on. And so we want to be able to draw, and this can be you're responsible for this aspect of the product or this particular customer need, this particular use case. And yeah, anyway, we give them sort of a sense of clear accountability. And then we want them to be able to make collaborative decisions within that. So they want the team to be able to talk to each other and work together and have some sense of collaboration and some sense of group decision making. Again, on a functional team, on an experienced team, this can happen somewhat organically. I happen to love a process for decision making, which I wanted to share with you. I call this my pro tip. That's a little inflated. But anyway, there's something called integrative decision making, or IDM, and it comes out of holacracy. Has anybody heard of holacracy? Some folks have, some folks haven't. It's what, if you read the stories about Zappos firing their managers or getting rid of their managers, it's because they're implementing a management system called holacracy. It's a very, very formalized management system. I have a lot to say about it, which I will not say right now on camera. But I really love IDM. I really love integrative decision making. If you read about this and then try it, you will most likely fail. It will probably be very painful. I'll tell you a story about how I actually think I destroyed a company using IDM once, but That's a story for another day. Yeah, really not now, because I'm trying to be inspiring right now. But that said, there are professional facilitators, people who can run it through. I'm happy to introduce you to some folks. I can actually walk people through it and talk to you about how to do it. It's one of those things that once you see it done once, it becomes really, really easy. But when you try to learn it from a book, it's kind of like yoga, right? You can't really learn it from a book. But once someone shows, you're like, oh, that's the way it's supposed to be. And I've got it. So think about integrative decision making from Holacracy. The next kind of group of characteristics that I want you to try when it comes to processes and tools is cadence planning using value-based requirements and economic prioritization. Boy, I love syllables for these, right? Let's break this down a little bit. Cadence planning means that we're going to maybe do a daily stand-up, a weekly tactical, a monthly strategic meeting, quarterly road mapping, whatever you call them, whatever frequency works for you, you're going to do them on a regular cadence. We used to call this anyway when I was an Agile coach, the heartbeat, right? The heartbeat of the Agile process. And what happens is when you're working in this kind of rhythm, one, we like music, our hearts beat in a certain kind of rhythm. I think humans naturally respond to a certain kind of rhythmic quality of life. But also what I notice is that if we're planning only when there's a need to plan, we tend to generate more crises and more emergencies and more problems. Whereas if we make planning a habit, especially when we're collaboratively working together to plan and pull those things into our system, it just works a lot better. So cadence planning, again, some kind of cadence. I'm not going to be prescriptive today about what kind of cadence is best. I believe you can vary this quite a bit. Value-based requirements, I think, is hugely important. I think it's massively important because companies are really good. We're really good at saying, I want a thing that does this for this kind of customer. And then we hire really smart technology people who are really good at saying, these are all the details that we need to do in order to create this system. The problem is that we get a disconnect between the people that run this aspect of the organization and the people that run this aspect of the organization. And we run too quickly. We go too quickly into the details. And what we really need is some kind of interstitial layer, some kind of layer that we can both look at, that's in language that we can both understand, that takes this big idea and breaks it down into those chunks that I was showing. These are the chunks that flow through our system. We could call these user stories. We could call them use cases. We could call them, I don't know, there's jobs to be done. We were actually talking with a potential customer today, and we were using that language. Whatever that may be, we need to be talking about and actually tracking the stuff flowing through our system that's a value-based, that actually has a customer value to it, and that we're talking about it in non-technical business language so everybody can understand it. Because as technical people, I know this, they tend to like to show how smart we are. Actually, I shouldn't say we, I'm not that technical. And then we kind of get lost. We get kind of too lost in the details. Well, you don't understand that, and this weird posturing thing, and everything kind of goes crazy. And then, then the business people are ordering people around. It's just horrible. The last thing is economic prioritization. Once we have the value-based requirements, we can look at we can then prioritize things. I can say this one or this one. There can be only one. It's like Highlander, right? There can be only one. I can pull only one thing in. So which one am I going to pull in? Most organizations don't do a very good job of this. They don't do a very good job. What do we prioritize on instead of economics? Why do you think one thing gets done and the other thing doesn't get done? What are some reasons?
Looks easier.
Looks easier. That's like the huge one. Sexiness, excitement. Whoever's paying for it. We're doing this one, right? That kind of command and control. Somebody stands like this in a meeting and tells us what to do. The thing that's maybe more painful, that maybe like someone's been complaining about more, but it's not really economic prioritization. As a matter of fact, this comes from the work of a guy named Don Reinertsen, who wrote a book called The Principles of Product Development Flow. Has anybody read Reinertsen or hung out with him? He speaks in Martian most of the time. His book will take you a year to get through, and his course will, if you take it, his weekend course will feel like a year. But one of the things he says is, when he's done the modeling, that most organizations, if not all organizations, really do a really, really shitty job of economic prioritization. And if you even do a mediocre job of economic prioritization, you will be miles ahead of your competition, miles ahead of anybody else. Now, Reinertsen has created a process, which is my second pro tip, called Weighted Shortest Job First, which you can actually find out on the Scaled Agile Framework website. They're really a big fan of this. Again, I'm not going to comment on the Scaled Agile Framework and Dean Leffingwell's work. I love Dean. I've worked with him. But the weighted shortest job first is a way to have a structured conversation about which thing is going to be more valuable, and to look at it both in terms of what's easiest, because what's easiest is sometimes more valuable, right? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And so you weight this, it's a weighted equation. It's a really hard thing to weighted shortest job for WSJF. And again, this is also one of those processes that looks good on paper, and then you try to do it and you're like, it doesn't really make sense. You really kind of need someone to show you how it's done, and you get through it. But again, once you get there, once you're using it, it's really golden. I actually use this in my kind of personal life. I'm trying to like decide what to do. It actually helps a lot. This is the last bit, and I said, this is kind of my last characteristic. And I was really kind of struggling with how to end this, because to me, this topic is not an abstract, technical topic. When we're talking about software, when people ask me what I do, I say, and people who aren't in the world, and so I don't have the shortcuts to talk to them about, I say, I deal with the human side of technology, or the human side of creating technology. And what's interesting is that it is all humans, and what's really interesting is that we're talking about complex systems with a lot of uncertainty built into them that require much more personal engagement, individual engagement than manufacturing did, which is where a lot of these ideas came from, right? And a lot of what I care about is I care about creating systems where people feel engaged, and systems that are creating true value, real value for their customer. Not systems that are efficient necessarily, because I think efficiency, I think we should probably throw that idea. I need to go back to my MBA and tell them, let's not teach efficiency anymore. Let's not teach cost out. Let's not teach economies of scale. We need to talk about organizational effectiveness. We need to think about what our organizations are and what they're really trying to accomplish. And what's interesting is this requires leadership. This requires people to generate a vision and pull people with them towards that vision. And I have to say, after years of working in technology, we're not so great at it. And I think I've discovered the reason that we're not so great at leadership sometimes. And that's because we care incompletely. We care about competence a great deal, right? We care about technical prowess and competence. And competence is a great way to inspire people and to pull them towards you. But it turns out that if you're missing warmth, and this is a kind of a measurable quantity, actually, this comes out of some social science, which I'm going to show you in just a sec, or a model from the social sciences that I'm going to show you in a minute. If we begin with warmth, so people are asking a question. If we're encountering a person, they're asking us first, do we care about them? And then they're asking us second, are you able to match your promise? And if we keep leading with competence, we're only answering the second half of that question. We're not answering the first half of that question. And it leaves people kind of off balance. Let me show you this. I wouldn't be a good consultant if I didn't have a good 2x2 matrix. So I'm going to finish with this. I'm finishing strong. Along the bottom, we have competence. And along the left-hand side, we have warmth, right? And these, again, are measurable quantities that the social sciences have been looking at for years. There's some, Amy Cuddy's book, Presence, which this comes from, is really fascinating. So let me ask you this. If someone is over here in the lower left hand, they're warm but not competent, do you want to work with that person? I mean, sorry, they're neither warm nor competent. No. We get rid of those people right away. As in all good 2x2 matrices, the lower left hand is always the one that you X out. How about the person who is warm but not competent? Does anybody work with anybody like that? Again, Citrusbyters, don't raise your hands. All right. Me, no. Warm but not competent, right? We probably work with those kinds of people. We probably feel a little bit of pity towards them. We probably let them plan the Christmas party, maybe, right? You know what I mean? We want to keep them around because they're warm. They seem to really care, and they seem to maybe they're really trying, but we don't really trust them with the good stuff. Now let me ask you about these people down here. Lower right-hand corner. Competent but not warm. It depends, right? If they're like, honestly, I've done some executive coaching, and this is my sweet spot for some reason, right? I deal with people who are really, really competent, really, really great at their job, but they haven't yet developed that sense of care or their ability to express. And when they try to lead, they do this harder. They always kind of go back to competence. They go back to competence. One thing that's really interesting is that if you ask people what course they want to take in order to improve themselves, they'll always choose a competence course. If you ask them what course their coworkers should take in order to improve themselves, they will always choose a warmth course, right? So we value it in others, but we tend not to value it in ourselves. So they call this the, what is it? It's the happy warrior. is the person who is both warm and caring and also competent. This is the corner, and I think as technologists in technology organizations, this is the place that we really need to get to, and this is the place that we need to push. Because this, to me, generates organizations that have trust, that are built upon trust and respect. And ultimately, all the process in the world isn't going to save you if you don't have an organization that has trust with each other, that respects each other. And if you do have an organization where people trust and respect each other, they will most likely find the fastest way to do stuff. So let's focus on this. That's all I got for you, but here we got some time for questions too. Could I get some water? Please.
Yeah, Bob. Through your experience, you've learned that starting sooner doesn't always result in a quicker result. You've learned all these principles. How do you convince the people you're working with, either the executives or even technical people, to give you the chance, the slack, to start that way, and then to continue, if things go along the project, to stick with that and not panic and fall back on the bad habits?
Yeah, well, I mean, then you're talking about organizational change, which is a whole other ball of wax, right? And I think, one, you have to start with a little bit of information so everybody has the same baseline, and probably a good bit of inspiration. And also, I think there's a lot of data around this, but a good crisis doesn't hurt, right? Like some particular pain point. And I think a good leader who's trying to lead organizational change will turn up the volume on that pain. Will actually, to create visualizations, allow us to see, if we don't change, this is going to be the result in 5 years. I worked with a team a little while ago where we were doing a year's planning, or we were planning an application that they were working on, and it was a big healthcare data company, and the team that was doing the planning and doing all the estimation, they figured out that they were fully a year behind. Like once they really did the estimation, it was a full year behind, and I could see the manager, like everybody just. But better now than in a year, right? Better to know it now. But I mean, it also speaks to sometimes there's not an ability to hear these things, and I've worked in a lot of organizations where that's not the case. Some friends of mine who do some management consulting that I used to work with before, they really lead with, and this is a hot topic, we'll get drunk and this is all we'll talk about is how to do this particular thing. And we haven't come up with the right answer yet, I don't think. But one of their philosophies is, let's just try some practices. Let's try small teams. Let's see what happens. Let's try some cadence planning and see what happens. There's this idea that like, let's just try this little bite. And then maybe if we get some results from that, then we can kind of create an engine and keep going. I will also say that if you want to share this information with people, email me there. I'll send you a PDF of this slide deck. I will also send you a PDF or a Mobi file of a book that I wrote a couple years ago along with my colleagues at a previous company called Agile Business, which has some of this stuff in it. Other questions? How was that thorough, huh? All right.
So this idea of Slack, so when you introduce Slack, is this like time between the user stories being done? Or like the development time is like a week or a couple of days?
Think about it as excess capacity in your system, right? And let me tell you a story about how a company is using this that we may not think about. Has everybody gone shopping at Zara? Zara, the clothing company, right? Do you guys know how they run their factories? Do you know about this, right? So they run their factories at about 75% capacity. And the reason they do that is because they have people going to their stores and looking at what's getting returned. And when something gets returned, they're collecting data about this. And sometimes they hit on, well, if we narrowed the lapel on this particular thing, we would sell more of that particular thing. They can then spin that up. And they have something like a 3-week turnaround from insight to something being back on the shelves in the store. They're only able to do this because they have Slack in the system. And again, this is efficient. But the MBA classes that I went to, they would have said, never do that. You run your factories at 100% all the time, 24 hours a day. That's how it's economies of scale and the efficient use of resources, right? That's the way you do it, and I think we're really changing. The way I've done it in a consulting environment is we would actually have excess capacity. We would have consultants who were what we called on the bench, and we always had a philosophy that we should always have 3 or 4 guys or women who are not working, who are not doing something. Likewise, I think when it comes to software, however, it's up to the team to figure out, right? It's really, you're going to focus on a few items at a time. What's the magic number? And we're introducing Slack by limiting WIP. We're just saying we're not going to pull anything in until we. And I've had teams be really formal about this, like we only work on one story at a time. Like I've worked with teams like that, and it seems to be pretty effective. But what do we do at Citrusbyte? Brady?
Yeah, so just one thought to create Slack, something that I've done with teams before. You do your sprint planning, and you estimate, and you put everything up on the board, whiteboard perhaps, and then you actually remove one item. And that artificially creates Slack, but it's also really a powerful mental change too, when you realize there's something up on the board that I don't have to do.
That's wonderful.
and you actually spend more time doing these things that are left on the board better.
I'm smiling because that's what Coco Chanel said about style. Get dressed and then take one item off, right? That's how you have style. Anyway.
You say the planning, like if you have like, say pre-Slack, right?
Yeah.
You have all those mites, and you're looking at your development horizon, that could go on for months and months or longer.
Right.
What does this kind of formalization do to your planning? Right? If I've got no Slack in my system, am I cutting my, or not really cutting probably the wrong way, but shortening my planning horizon, so I'm looking at, say, a quarter rather than a year, or those two completely disparate type of considerations?
Yeah, so I think, so there's a couple of models, and actually maybe I'll let some other Citrusbyters, is that what we call ourselves, by the way, Citrusbyters? Yeah, that works, yeah. Comment on this, but you know, I think one, we need to think about our applications as not like fixed things. Like, we keep working on it until we decide to sunset it, right? So, and we grow it based on, we start off with a nugget of value, and then we add value to that, add value to that, add value to that, and that's just sort of a continuous process. So we enter a continuous planning stage, you know, continuous planning life cycle. We also enter a continuous deployment life cycle. One of the things we do is we ask ourselves, what's something that we can deliver of value to the customer in the next 3 or 4 weeks? You know, like that's a mental frame that we walk into every project with. We don't walk into the project saying, what's everything you want? What's everything you think you need? Because if we don't start prototyping immediately, or if you don't start actually building something immediately, you're not getting the feedback, you're not doing test and learn, and you're not able to actually, you know, learn from your mistakes. You're going to be wrong. Actually, we were talking to somebody today who said that whenever they just plan this thing up front without actually releasing it and having customers use it and getting the data back from it, he says 9 times out of 10 we're wrong. And this is a very, very big global brand who's saying this to us. 9 times out of 10 they're wrong. And they had some very expensive mistakes kind of sitting on, you know, in their recent history. So I think that's the model. Anything to add to that or contradict me on?
I think you mean, not to contradict in this case, but I think it's all about framing the workflow, so you can do things like, you know, defining sprints. You can do things by, you know, limiting the amount of work that goes into a sprint, making trades. So going back to your comment about, you know, creating Slack, a big part of that I think is about, you know, communicating with the client or whoever the stakeholder is and saying, okay, we have this much bandwidth, now let's trade some things around. Let's make sure we have room to adequately research this. You know,
Yeah.
so those pieces I think becomes a relationship about trust. That's like super important to make this work.
The trust and respect. One of my favorite stories comes from one of the people who taught me Scrum 10 plus years ago. And he was working with a company that was doing some they were a defense contractor, and they were building some software reporting directly into somebody at the DoD, a general at the DoD. And this guy was coming to Pennsylvania. They got him seeing product demos every month or so. He would come out and see. And it wasn't something they could deploy right away, but it was something they were kind of waiting to deploy. But once he saw the backlog and he started to realize that things were movable on that backlog, apparently this light bulb went off on his brain one day, and he said, "Can I move this stuff?" And they said, "Yes, you can move whatever you want to." He's like, "Well, I want you to eliminate this, move this up to the top, and we're going to deploy next month because that way I can save more lives." Right? This will actually save, and I think it speaks to that level of trust, that level of comfort, and I think a lot of it is including, again, this idea of value-based requirements. It gives us all a chance to talk about the same thing together, rather than the technical team obfuscating in the business team ordering, and which is again this sort of and generating this. I've written about this before, but this wall that tends to rise up between the business side of the house and the technical side of the house, which is so poisonous to actually creating value. In the back there.
Do you think Zappos was successful when they eliminated to use this out that we're talking about?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, I'm not inside Zappos. I actually am friends with one of the people who was responsible for one aspect of that rollout, and I know some people who've been involved with it. I don't have a good answer for that. I think when you offer, a lot of people left the company, but then again, they also offered everybody a buyout. Like if any big company offered everybody a buyout of their contract if they left, I have a feeling you would hemorrhage people pretty quickly. I think it's a very bold move that they're making, and I'm watching with curiosity. But I don't have a strong. I think holacracy is very interesting, and I've worked with holacracy. I've worked inside of a holacracy. A company that I worked for a little while ago was operating as a holacracy. I think it's a very, very interesting model. I find it too rigid. Just like the Scaled Agile framework, just like Scrum, just like XP. I find all of these things a bit too rigid, but the principles are so rich, the practices are so valuable, and I think really what we're trying to move towards is a more mature organization, not a more rule-bound organization. So I have concerns about it, but very curious. I think it's bold. I think it's exciting.
Let's do
One more question? I think you had one right here.
What you just presented seems very, let's say, like, makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense when I talk about it like this, right? Yeah, and then you're going to go try it and you'll be like, ah. Yeah, that's why you hire consultants. No, sorry.
Work in practice, and if you do, can you share with us some of the ones that succeeded?
So it definitely works in practice. I mean, it's definitely how we do things at Citrusbyte. Does somebody want to share, maybe, do you have like an example of a way, I don't know if it's the M2X team or another team, like if we could just kind of give a concrete example. I don't mean to put you guys on the spot, but I am.
Which part specifically or everything?
Well, I think maybe it's the limiting whip and the keeping queues short. So those two things, like how does that work in the real world?
Yeah, so one option, and Don't even talk to this, is creating multiple backlogs. Because limiting the queue is really critical. I think I don't know if it's psychological or not, but if you have a giant list of things to do, you get almost nothing done. Try it. Try putting a giant list on the board for your own self, and you'll get almost nothing done. If you have one or two things or three things, you actually get all of those things done.
Yeah.
So creating multiple backlogs is one solution, and for the customer, they still feel like they're able to organize the backlog, but you're actually totally divorcing the actual backlog from what the customer is organizing.
And we
So
actually
you're creating-
prioritize them too. Like it's priority 1 backlog, priority 2 backlog, priority 3, 4, 5.
Yeah. And the gray ones that are just never going to get done. Yeah. Backlog fantasy.
Things don't get lost.
Now,
And then
follow
what-
up on that. So this began like this, like that's the culture that was set.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying how do you get there from where you are now, or is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think the culture is set. I mean, we're doing this at organizations like AT&T and Goldman Sachs, right? I mean, they're not like progressive software companies like that started with software in the DNA. But I think, if you're sitting here and you think what Bob presented is reasonable, I think you'll find your coworkers or your clients are just as willing to listen and learn to such reasonable sentiment. For us, I mean, if you go into the team of 4 people or 20 people or 50 people, it doesn't really matter what the team size is. We do like to keep them small. It has a maximum throughput. And for that reason, because of that reason, you have to prioritize things. And you should have the same method of prioritization, and it should be based on the value that you're bringing to your customers and to your business. And therefore, you should go through that exercise regardless of the number of people you have assigned to a project, whether you're a consultant or an internal team. So I think there's a lot of tools, a lot of conversation points that you can use to kind of direct people towards the same model. I think that the case we made for Slack, Bob mentioned this earlier. You certainly can take organizations at scale and say, hey, let's experiment with this. Maybe we don't need to do it with 100 teams that we have deployed right now, but let's take one and let's see if the work quality improves. If we embrace these principles with one team for a month, what's the opportunity cost? How big is that? How big a risk is that for the organization? And if it works, if it improves things, what's the benefit we'll get? The benefit will be huge because we can scale that out to the second team, third team, the other 100 teams.
And what's so great about software is it's actually, to a certain degree, measurable.
Yeah.
You can actually count from month to month how many features did we ship, how many, and that's something you can point to as a fact. It's not just conjecture. It's not subjective. It's a very objective measure.
Right.
There are also ways of creating Slack that are indirect, and I'm not saying that necessarily it's not tricking people, but it's using different terminology, like saying this is a stretch goal, or this thing right here is we're gonna do research on this.
Yeah.
So there's ways of introducing Slack without saying this is not happening here.
Right. There's also a really funny thing where if your engineer estimates something at 40 hours in a week, and the manager says like do it in 30, the next week they just add an extra 10 hours. Like they just add it or whatever, right? Like they just change their estimates. I mean, you can't really get around that stuff. So just keeping the focus around value creation, I think, is really powerful, and then measuring that, like I said.
Yeah, and I will say just two things. So one is that so we were talking about describing kind of land and expand is the way I think that's very military, but still, the idea is that we want to create a small project first, contain it, hopefully there's some value wrapped around it, and as Brady says, you can measure that. Like, hey, this worked really well here. And we've learned something about how it operates in this culture and this organization. What we had to go, all the pain we had to go through in order to change, because we don't like to change very much. And then, but we'll see some success, and people working in other teams will say, I want some of that, and then hopefully you can kind of expand from there. If you want to apply this personally, by the way, I do this. I keep my own. It's a Kanban board, and I don't know if you've ever seen the book called Personal Kanban. By Jim Benson. It's a great place to start to get you doing this, to get manage your own whip to start off with, right? Limit your own whip and keep your own queue short, and I think and kind of build the habit yourself, and then you can kind of expand from there. Do we have time for one more question? I see an excited hand raised.
One last question is regarding the DA commitment that you mentioned, because you talk about it really just briefly, but I think it's the biggest part. Because what you mentioned is when you have a CEO coming to see you and say, does this feature will be live by the end of March? Right. Because I need to plan all the marketing and everything coming with it. How you deal with that? Is that the primary?
Yeah, this is the classic problem, and I think, and I don't want to actually. I wanted to say something about this before, that you don't want to necessarily ignore market events. Like if you're working for a company and that's Christmas dependent on your revenue, right? You've got to ship something by Christmas. We're not talking about not doing that. But it may be that, like, we'll say, look, we're going to ship a feature that's going to address this kind of customer problem, but we're not yet sure of exactly every bullet point that's going to be in that feature. We'll get closer to that. But that's a little bit of what Adonia was talking about. Like, we need to bring that CEO into this planning process and get them comfortable with this, which may not be possible. It's not for every CEO. It's not.
When you bring in someone that will make a decision that is not close to the field, like you mentioned earlier.
Well, you want them participating and giving information, and you want them present, but you don't necessarily want them making the decision, right? Try to stop that. I totally get it.
The key word is responsible, too.
Yeah.
So it has to still be a responsible delay.
Yeah. It's the last responsible moment. For some things, that responsible moment may be months in advance. And if you're going to plan something like that, then you need, I believe, to take a lot of time to do that planning and do that planning collaboratively as a team. That is actually an overhead. There is an overhead to doing that kind of planning if the planning is going to be accurate. The problem is that most organizations get really, really comfortable with blowing their deadlines all the time, and they certainly get really comfortable with blowing the lives of their employees all of the time, right? And I think if you're, and what I'm trying to describe is, and there's nothing, I was talking to somebody before this, we were talking ahead of time, right? There's no perfect system, there's no perfect organization, but if you begin to push responsibility down to the team a little bit, if everybody understands that the way to move faster is to focus and the way to move faster is to delay commitment, then you get to hash this kind of stuff out. But it's all humans, and it's all going to be messy, and it's all going to be imperfect at the end of the day. And I rarely get to say no. What I used to do is I would say, you can have them both, but if you only had to have one, which one would you have? Right? A little like feature Sophie's choice, right? And I find phrasing, because CEOs really don't like to hear the word no. They really don't like to hear that word. And so I stopped saying it, but effectively, we have to focus on something, right, of course, to get it done. So we're going to get one of these done for you first. Which one? And get them to make that decision for you. Because then you can do feature shaving, you can do scope shaving on this other one because it's less important, and you can be safer about that. And you have something deployed and ready to go. So you've got something out there. Jonathan's looking at me. We got to stop questions. This has been really lovely. Thank you all so much. I have business cards up here. Yeah, thank you. Bibliography, if you want to know where all this information lives and comes from, that I put up here. And also, again, you get the slide deck by sending me an email. Happy to send it to you.